In the freezing cold of a working-class neighborhood, a black mechanic with a criminal past lived quietly under the watchful, cautious eyes of his neighbors. One night, just after closing his shop, he discovered a young boy trembling in a thin shirt, hiding beneath a frozen bench. Although afraid of being misunderstood, he brought the boy inside and called the police. What he didn't know was that this act would not only save a child's life, it would become the turning point of his own. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. The wind cut sharper than usual that winter evening, sliding through the narrow streets of the neighborhood like a knife through fabric. It was the kind of cold that made even the street lights shiver, their dim amber glow flickering above cracked sidewalks and sagging porches. Ashburn Avenue was quiet, save for the occasional sound of tires crunching frozen gravel, or the distant bark of a chained dog. This part of New Jersey had long since been left behind. By prosperity, by city planners, even by hope. People here worked hard, kept their heads down, and locked their doors by 6. At the corner where Ashburn met an alley lined with overflowing trash bins, a squat brick garage stood with its shutters half rolled down. The sign above it, Terry's Auto Repair, had once been red and proud. Now it was faded to the color of rust and time, its edges curled like dead leaves. Inside, under the soft yellow light of a hanging bulb, a tall, broad-shouldered man wiped his hands with a shop rag stained in oil and old stories. Terry Jackson, 50 years old, with a face lined deeper than his age and eyes that carried too many winters, moved through his space with the quiet rhythm of a man who'd long since learned that noise rarely brought anything good. Years ago, Terry had made a mistake, or perhaps, more truthfully, the world had decided that one moment of weakness would define him forever. A burglary conviction had followed him out of prison like a stray shadow, always a step behind. The records said he'd served his time, the neighbors said otherwise. No one here ever really forgot, or forgave. He'd bought the garage with what was left of an inheritance, hoping to build something honest, and he had. The tools were always clean, the bills always fair, the repairs always reliable, but reputation did not rebuild as easily as carburetors. People crossed the street when they saw him sweeping the sidewalk. Mothers pulled their children a little closer when walking past his door. Some even left their engines running when they came to drop off a car, too afraid or too proud to linger. One man just last week had stared Terry in the eye the entire time he worked on his brakes, arms crossed tight like he was watching a criminal disarm a bomb. Terry never argued, he never protested. What would be the point? In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, he was the ghost everyone tolerated but no one spoke to. He had become part of the scenery, like the broken fire hydrant or the dented mailbox no one bothered to fix. Children didn't trick or treat at his door come Halloween. He left the porch light off anyway. Teens whispered stories about him, exaggerated tales that made him into something darker than he ever was. And the adults, well, they just stared a little too long, spoke a little too softly when he walked into the corner store. Even the cashier, a kid barely out of high school, rang up his purchases like handling evidence. Business at the garage barely trickled in. Most folks only stopped by when their cars gave up a block too soon, too stubborn to make it to a real mechanic. They'd sigh, check their watches, and look anywhere but at him as he fixed what needed fixing. When the job was done, they paid quickly, always in cash, and left without thanks, sometimes without even a nod. Terry didn't expect kindness. He didn't even hope for decency anymore. The days passed in a steady loop. Repair, eat, read, sleep. Talk only to the cat, keep your head down, stay out of trouble. He had found a strange sort of peace in the loneliness, a quiet that hurt less than rejection. Better to be invisible than resented. That night was no different. He'd just finished changing the fan belt on an old Chrysler, his hands still slick with grease, when he checked the clock. Nearly 8. Time to close. He reached for the chain to pull the garage door down, the same way he did every night, with a slow, deliberate motion, as though trying not to wake the world. Outside, the street was empty, not a soul in sight. And yet something felt different. Not loud, not obvious, but like the cold air had shifted just enough to carry something else on its back. He paused, listened, and the silence answered. The kind of silence that comes before something you never saw coming. He almost didn't see it, just a small movement like a twitch in the corner of his eye. But something pulled his gaze across the street to the broken bench that sat under the crooked street lamp, the one no one ever used except to sleep off a bottle or wait for a bus that rarely came. The light above it flickered weakly, casting thin shadows that bent and stretched like they were afraid of the dark. That's when he saw it. A shape, slight and hunched, wedged awkwardly between the bench and the frozen ground, unmoving except for a shiver so faint it looked like a ripple in the air. Terry stood still, watching from the garage entrance, the cold nipping at his fingertips through the worn holes in his gloves. He narrowed his eyes, uncertain. It wasn't unusual to see someone sleeping rough in this neighborhood. Poverty had roots here deeper than most trees, but this shape didn't look right. It was too small, too fragile, not the slumped bulk of an adult, but something younger. He stepped forward, careful not to move too fast, boots crunching against salt-scattered concrete. The air was sharp, stinging his lungs, and the wind tugged at his coat like it wanted to keep him inside where it was safe. But something had changed in that stillness, something that tugged deeper than instinct. As he crossed the street, the shape stirred, just slightly, and a pair of wide, pale eyes snapped open. What he saw stopped him cold. A child. A boy. No more than 6, maybe 7 at most. Skin ghostly under the flickering light, blonde hair clumped together with dirt and sweat. His clothes too thin for this time of year, just a hoodie with sleeves too short and sneakers that barely clung to his feet. He was curled into himself like an animal trying to disappear. When he noticed Terry approaching, his whole body flinched, legs kicking out in panic. He tried to scramble up, but his limbs gave out before he could stand. He collapsed onto his side, arms splayed awkwardly, his breath ragged and visible in the freezing air. Terry's heart twisted. He hesitated for just a beat, then crouched low, holding both hands out, palms up. "Hey, kid, I'm not going to hurt you. You hear me? It's okay." The boy didn't answer. His eyes darted wildly, not quite focusing, and his lips moved like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Terry inched closer, feeling every second stretch like an hour. The boy tried to push himself back, but there was no strength left in his limbs. He was running on the edge of something dangerous now. Hypothermia, shock, who knew what else? "I got a warm place," Terry said quietly, his voice softer than he'd used in years. "Just across the street, no one else, just me, and a heater. You don't have to talk, just nod if you want help." The boy didn't nod, but he didn't run either. That was enough. Terry moved slowly, gently gathering the boy into his arms. He weighed almost nothing. There was a stiffness in his joints that didn't belong to someone so young, a kind of tension that came from being afraid too long. The boy's hands were like ice, fingers curled into fists that wouldn't unclench. Terry could feel the bones through his coat. The moment he stepped back into the garage, the warmth hit like a wall. The space heater in the corner was old but stubborn. It kept the air just above freezing, which tonight felt like summer. Terry laid the boy on a pile of clean towels beside the heater and pulled down a heavy blanket from the cot. He wrapped him tight, careful not to jar him. The boy's eyes never left him, but they were no longer wide with panic, just wary and exhausted. "I'll get you something hot," Terry murmured, reaching for the kettle he kept on the hot plate. He poured warm water into a mug, mixed in a spoonful of instant cocoa, and knelt beside the boy, holding it out. The boy didn't move. Terry placed the mug beside him, then stepped back, letting the silence stretch. In the distance, a siren wailed and faded. The boy's head jerked slightly, but he didn't speak, didn't cry. He just stared at the floor like it might offer answers. Terry noticed then, more than the cold or the silence, that the boy hadn't made a sound. Not a word. Not a whimper. Not even when he fell. His lips were chapped and pale, and his throat moved like he wanted to say something but couldn't. It wasn't just fear. He couldn't talk. That realization settled in Terry's chest like a weight. He looked closer. The hoodie the boy wore had a small tear near the collarbone. Beneath it, a faded bruise. Not the kind a kid gets from roughhousing. The kind that came from restraint. Terry's breath caught. His eyes drifted to the boy's wrists. Thin, with faint red rings where skin had been rubbed raw. Like rope. Or plastic ties. His mind recoiled, then forced itself forward, connecting pieces that shouldn't have belonged to any child. A sick feeling crawled up his spine. He stood up, moved to the door, and pulled it shut tight. Not that anyone was likely to come knocking. Most of his neighbors wouldn't have stopped if they'd seen him carrying the boy in. They would have turned their heads, quickened their pace. Some would have assumed the worst, whispered about that ex-con finally showing his true colors. Others would have just felt justified in avoiding him all along. He looked back at the child now curled beside the heater, hands still trembling beneath the blanket. No one was coming for him, at least no one good. And Terry knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that whatever this boy had run from, or been taken from, wasn't finished yet. He rubbed his face with calloused hands, paced the floor once, twice. Every instinct told him to call someone. The police, child services, anybody, but the thought caught in his throat. He could already see the headlines, already hear the questions, the accusations. He'd be in cuffs before he could explain. And yet, the alternative, doing nothing, was worse, unforgivable. Terry Jackson had spent 2 decades paying for one bad choice. Tonight, he stood at the edge of another. Only this time, someone else's life was on the line. Terry stood in the center of the garage, surrounded by the familiar scent of oil, steel, and old air, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The boy, still nameless, still silent, lay bundled in the corner like a forgotten package fate had dropped at his feet. Terry watched the rise and fall of the child's chest, slow and shallow, as the blanket wrapped tighter around his thin frame. The heater hummed low beside him, its orange coil glowing steadily, casting long shadows across the grease-stained floor. Outside, the wind had picked up, hissing through the cracks in the doorframe, but inside, time seemed to pause, as if the garage itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide what kind of man he was going to be. He reached for the old rotary phone mounted to the wall near his desk, its receiver dusted but not forgotten. His hand hovered over the numbers, fingers twitching with hesitation. He didn't fear the police as much as he feared the way they would look at him. The questions, the doubt, the unspoken accusations that came not from evidence but from assumption. One glance at his record, and the boy's silence would speak volumes. Terry couldn't defend against it. They wouldn't see a man who'd lifted a freezing child off the sidewalk. They'd see a convict in a garage with a boy who couldn't speak, covered in bruises, with no one else around to say otherwise. And that truth, however unfair, was one he'd lived with long enough to know better than to ignore. He paced. The boy stirred at the sound, eyes fluttering open just for a moment. There was something haunted behind those eyes, not just fear but fatigue, that didn't belong on a child's face. Terry forced a smile, though it hurt the muscles in his cheeks, and crouched beside him again. "You're safe here. You hear me?" he said gently, unsure whether the boy could understand. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you." Still no response. Terry exhaled slowly and rose, walking to the old filing cabinet in the back of the shop. He pulled out a roll of gauze, some antiseptic wipes, and a pair of clean socks he'd bought on clearance but never used. One by one he tended to the boy, wiping dried blood from a scraped elbow, wrapping the angry red line across his wrist, slipping the socks over his freezing feet with a care that came from someplace deeper than duty. The boy flinched at first touch but didn't pull away. He didn't look at Terry either. It was like his body was present, but his spirit had slipped behind some locked door, waiting for proof it was safe to return. He stepped away, wiping his hands on his jeans, and glanced at the wall clock. Nearly 9, too late for the neighborhood store to still be open. Even if it was, the cashier would eye him suspiciously if he came in looking like this, grimy, nervous, and buying medicine or baby food. He could already feel the unspoken weight of the stairs pressing against his back. He needed help, but not the kind that came in a uniform. Not yet. After a long silence, the boy reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and pulled out something small. A button, no bigger than a dime, smooth and black, with a strange emblem carved into it. He held it up without a word, offering it like a secret or a clue. Terry took it, careful not to show surprise, and examined the symbol. He didn't recognize it, but it felt expensive, intentional. "Someone's looking for you, huh?" he murmured, more to himself than to the boy. The boy blinked, just once, not a nod, but not denial, and Terry knew. This wasn't a runaway, this wasn't an accident. This was something much worse. He stared at the old phone in his hand, at the name written on the card, the kind of call that would change everything, the kind of choice that made a man, not by what he'd done before, but by what he did next. And Terry Jackson, grease-stained, mistrusted, forgotten by the street he lived on, decided to stop being afraid of the wrong things. He decided to be seen. He straightened up and looked at the ceiling, old pipes creaking faintly with the change in temperature. For a moment, he allowed himself a simple thought. What if he didn't call? What if he just let the boy stay here tonight, fed him something warm, gave him shelter, waited till morning? Maybe then he'd have time to come up with a better plan, one that didn't risk everything on a single roll of the dice. But deep down he knew that delay was just fear dressed up as logic. The boy didn't have time. Whatever had happened to him, whatever had left him mute, shaking and alone on that bench in the cold, it hadn't been kind. And it wouldn't stop looking for him. If someone out there had gone through the trouble of binding his wrists, of dumping him in a place like this, they weren't finished. And Terry, for all his scars and solitude, wasn't the kind of man who'd turn his back on a child and pretend the world would work it out. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and dialed. The call rang twice before a calm female voice answered, crisp and professional. "Child Protective Services, how may I help you?" Terry's throat felt dry, but his voice came out even, measured. "I've got a child. Found him outside my shop. He's not speaking, might be hurt, might have been taken." He gave the address, keeping it short, factual, the way he'd learned to speak in court years ago. No room for emotion, no space for mistakes. The woman on the other end asked questions. How old, physical condition, how long he'd been there. Terry answered each one as clearly as he could, aware that every word might be replayed, recorded, doubted later. He could almost hear her typing. When she asked for his name, he hesitated, just for a moment. "Terry Jackson," he said finally, and braced himself. And there was a pause. A shift in the tone. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson. We'll dispatch a unit immediately. Please do not leave the child unattended." He hung up and exhaled. There it was, no going back. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. He boiled more water, made instant soup, and tried to coax the boy into eating. A few spoonfuls made it past his lips, but mostly the boy clung to the warmth, eyes darting toward the sound of every passing car. Terry knelt beside him and whispered the way people talk to animals caught in traps. Soft, steady, patient. When the knock came, it wasn't loud. 3 measured raps against the garage door. Then silence. Terry opened it to find 2 figures silhouetted against the street lamp. One a uniformed officer with a clipboard. The other a plain-clothes woman in a thick coat, with a badge around her neck, and a guarded expression on her face. "You Terry Jackson?" she asked, eyeing him not unkindly but cautiously. "I am," he replied. "The boy's inside. He's not talking." They entered without fanfare, their boots clunking softly on the concrete. The woman knelt beside the child, her voice trained and gentle. the way Terry's had been. The officer stayed near the door, eyes sweeping the room with that look, neutral but not trusting. Terry had seen it before. It wasn't personal, it was procedural, but it still made him feel like the walls had crept in closer. The woman's voice dropped, just audible. "We've had an alert out since yesterday. This boy, he matches a description from a case out of Pennsylvania. Abduction, high prefaces. They've been searching state lines." She looked at Terry then, and her eyes changed, softened maybe, or sharpened with understanding. "You may have just saved his life." Terry didn't know what to say. He just nodded. They asked a few more questions. When he mentioned the bruises and the button with the strange emblem, the officer took it into an evidence bag with gloved hands. The woman gathered the boy gently, cradling him as if afraid he might shatter, and for the first time the boy let out a small sound. A broken, rasping breath, like air escaping from something sealed too long. It wasn't a word, but it was something. As they stepped toward the door, the woman paused. "You did the right thing. Not everybody would have." Terry swallowed hard. "He didn't give me much of a choice." She smiled, faintly. "That's usually how it works." And then they were gone, swallowed into the night, into the blinking lights of the cruiser that pulled away a few minutes later, without sirens. Terry stood in the doorway long after the heater clicked off, long after the quiet returned. He watched the tail lights until they disappeared down the block. Behind him, the garage was silent, but something had shifted in the air. He wasn't sure if it was redemption or just relief, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost in his own life. He felt seen, and it didn't feel as scary as he thought it would. The next morning arrived with a softness that felt almost out of place on Ashburn Avenue. The cold was still sharp, the light still pale, but there was something different in the air. Something gentler, like the world had exhaled just a little. Terry was already awake, though he hadn't really slept. He had spent the early hours sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm by the first sip, watching the sun struggle to rise over rooftops, and listening to the tick of the wall clock that marked time with more patience than most people gave him. He didn't expect visitors. He didn't expect anything at all. After the night before, after the child, after the silence, after the decision. He had learned not to expect, only to endure. But just after 9, the sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled his attention toward the street. 2 black SUVs, quiet but unmistakable, came to a slow stop outside the garage. Terry's heart paused for a beat, not out of fear, not exactly, but with that cautious anticipation he had carried for years, the kind that never quite left a man who had been watched too closely for too long. From the first vehicle stepped Agent Myers, nodding in recognition. Then came Nathan's parents, dressed more simply today, coats zipped against the cold, expressions open but unreadable. The mother carried a small bouquet of white lilies in one hand, and something wrapped in brown paper in the other. The father followed behind, walking slowly, almost reverently. They were not flanked by cameras or reporters. They had come as people, not symbols. Terry met them at the door. The mother stepped forward first, her voice low, trembling in the way that only came from deep emotion held too long. "Mr. Jackson," she said, "we didn't sleep last night. Not because we were afraid anymore, but because we were trying to find the right words. And there aren't any. You brought our boy back to us, alive. Whole. We will never be able to thank you enough." She handed him the bouquet. Terry took it awkwardly, unused to flowers in his hands, unsure where to look. Then she gave him the package. He unwrapped it carefully to find a framed photo of Nathan, laughing in a sunlit field, younger, carefree. The kind of picture that reminded you of everything good in this world still worth fighting for. The father stepped forward next, holding an envelope thick with a check. Terry looked at it, but didn't reach for it. He was about to refuse. His mouth had already begun forming the words, when the man gently raised a hand. "We know what you're going to say," he said quietly. "You already said it yesterday, but we didn't come to offer you money." Not this time. We want to do something more meaningful, something that lasts." Terry frowned slightly, confused. "We've spoken to some people," the man continued, glancing at Myers, "and we'd like to renovate this place for you. Not to change it, just to restore it, rewire the lights, fix the roof, get the front windows replaced, a fresh coat of paint, the kind of work that says, this place matters. Because it does. And because you do." For a long moment, Terry didn't say anything. His fingers tightened slightly around the bouquet. The words didn't come easily. They rarely did. But when they did, they came low and true. "You don't owe me that," he said, voice rough with something that wasn't quite emotion but lived next door to it. The mother smiled, her eyes glassy. "We know. That's why we want to—" And somehow that made all the difference. Within a week, contractors had arrived. Not flashy or loud, but professional, men in union jackets with thermoses in hand, respectful and efficient. They worked around the garage's quirks, not against them. They fixed the flickering lights, reinforced the beams, sealed the drafts, replaced the cracked window with clear, thick glass. A sign painter came one morning and refreshed the name. Terry's Auto Repair, still carved in the same old style, but underneath, in smaller letters painted in gold leaf, a new line had been added, "Because kindness is a choice." People started to notice. Not all at once, but little by little they walked a bit slower past the garage. Some peeked in. Some even waved. One woman from the other end of the block brought by a basket of muffins and asked if he'd mind looking at her son's old pickup. A teenager who had once glared at him on the sidewalk now offered to sweep the snow. The changes were subtle, but they were real. And then, one afternoon, a small hand knocked on the newly painted door. Nathan stood there, bundled in a red coat, cheeks pink from the wind, holding something clutched in both hands. His mother stood behind him, watching quietly. The boy stepped forward, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a brand-new button, yellow with a smiley face, and placed it gently into Terry's palm. Then, without a word, he reached out and hugged him. Tight, certain, not afraid. Terry stood frozen for a breath, then slowly wrapped one arm around the boy's back, feeling how small he still was. When they pulled apart, Nathan looked up at him and gave a nod. The same way he had in the hospital when shown a picture of the man who had saved him. Only this time, it wasn't confirmation. It was connection. That night, the shop was quiet again, the workbench clean, the new light humming steadily overhead. Jasper curled up on the cot, purring like a soft engine. Terry sat in his chair, button still in his hand, turning it over slowly as if it were a coin from another life. He thought of the past, of the cold silences, of the stares, of the time he spent believing he had nothing to offer anyone but solitude. And then he looked around, at the walls, at the warm lights, at the bench no longer empty, and realized he'd been wrong. Because kindness, when given freely, when chosen despite fear, doesn't just fix what's broken. Sometimes it rebuilds everything. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.